Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. Okay, I want to welcome everybody to Great Decisions 2021. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, Carol and Tom Donovan in memory of Doris Sargent. These are major sponsors. Tonight is going to be a little different if you've attended the past 4 presentations. Those were more lectures, and then we asked questions. Now we will be watching videos. At the end of the video, the librarian will have some discussion questions to guide the conversation. While speaking, participants will need to unmute themselves to speak. Once they are finished speaking, they will need to mute themselves again. The program will end no later than 8 p.m., maybe earlier, depending on how chatty we are. And just some reminders, when we get to the discussion, just remember to be respectful of other viewpoints, stay on topic, don't hog the microphone, and limit your comments to 2 to 3 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to start up the DVD.
For all of recorded history, anyone seeking access to the vast, untapped riches of the Arctic has faced one key obstacle: ice. But the frozen North is no longer quite so frozen. As the polar ice cap retreats, the Arctic is becoming a focus for economic development and geopolitical rivalry. Great Decisions investigates the ambitions of Arctic powers, both old and new, and asks whether a spirit of cooperation can endure in one of the Earth's most inhospitable regions. The fight over the melting Arctic. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The
old mariners fought for the Northwest Passage because they believed it would prove a short commercial route between the East and the West. The route which Amundsen has located will be of considerable use to whalers, but it is unlikely that anything else will come of it. National Geographic Magazine, 1906.
By the time the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen completed the first transit of the Northwest Passage, it was widely understood that Arctic shipping routes offered no commercial value. But now, more than a century later, the Arctic is changing.
In 2019, Anchorage, Alaska experienced the highest recorded temperature in the history of their state. If there's any pretense about us being in denial about climate change, all they have to do is look to Anchorage and understand that it's the honest-to-God truth.
In July of 2020, Arctic sea ice cover hit its lowest ever recorded level. Scientists are predicting in the next decade or so, we may start to see some ice-free summers.
Climate change is going to impact the Arctic and it's going to impact the conditions of navigation. It could shorten the trip from Asia to Europe. If instead of taking the south route, you could go north along Russia.
In 2016, the Crystal Serenity cruise ship became the largest passenger vessel to sail through the Northwest Passage. It sailed from Vancouver to New York. We're at the beginning of what we can anticipate will be an increase in shipping into the high latitudes.
The melting of Arctic ice is making it easier than ever to access the region's untapped mineral wealth.
Ice melting has both positive and negative consequences. Access to the hydrocarbons and other mineral resources and bioresources in the Arctic is expanding.
13% of the world's undiscovered conventional oil resources reside in the Arctic. 30% of the undiscovered natural gas, nearly $1 trillion worth of minerals, including gold and gem-quality diamonds.
Geopolitical strategists around the world have taken note of the Arctic's new possibilities. Today, many countries are working to expand their influence at the top of the world.
The heightened interest in the Arctic has brought China and Russia together. As Russia and China become more active in the region, the US has realized that it needs to increase its engagement.
The region has become an arena for power and for competition. And the 8 Arctic states must adapt to this new future.
During the Cold War, the Arctic became a battleground as the US and the Soviet Union faced off across the pole.
What was once the impassable Arctic now provides the quickest routes for attack from a wide sector of Europe and Asia.
Geopolitical competition is going to become a more dominant feature of the Arctic. And this is also an area that the United States has somewhat neglected over the past few years.
When we thought the threat of over-the-pole ballistic missile attacks had ended, we were premature in our view that competition in the Arctic had diminished. And I think we will now pay a price for having to hurry to catch up.
Ура!
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Путин.
Vladimir Putin has quietly worked to strengthen Russia's strategic position in the Arctic to a level not seen since the Cold War.
The Russian president has very clearly explained that one of his main goals for Russia's Arctic policy is to develop the northern sea routes. It would mean upgrading a lot of transport infrastructure, port infrastructure, and so on.
They're not messing around. They understand the value of the Arctic. They're establishing bases and activity up there, natural resource extraction.
They have the most modernized strategic and nuclear submarines very close to Norway, but they have a bigger strategic ambition. And that, I would say, is mainly the strategic competition between Russia and the United States.
We are strengthening scientific, transport, navigation, and military infrastructure, which will allow us to secure Russia's interests in this strategically important region.
Some experts contend that Russia's military buildup should not be seen as a provocation.
Former Soviet facilities are being opened back up. They're building out additional infrastructure there, modern infrastructure. They're putting in longer runways. But a lot of what I have seen and what I've heard is that it's defensive in orientation.
Well, you could ask me if I'm concerned. I'm not. I think if that is a threat to anyone, it's a threat to the polar bears primarily. There's a need to have some sort of security presence in that enormous space.
Russia, perpetually strapped for cash, has been forced to turn for help to the newest player in the region, China.
After 2014 and the Western sanctions on Russia following Crimea annexation, Russia had no other choice than to turn toward China and accept Chinese investment. Russia and China are cooperating quite closely on the Yamal liquid natural gas project.
Yamal Peninsula is in the Russian high north. It has a large natural gas reserve, but Russia for a very long time has not had the ability to explore that natural gas because it requires large amount of financial capital.
Although Russia and China have cooperated effectively on oil and gas exploration, experts caution that the two countries' interests in the Arctic do not always align.
On the one hand, China is perceived by Russia as a promising partner in the Arctic. But on the other hand, the Sino-Russian relationship in the Arctic is sort of a marriage of convenience. Russia has no illusions about Chinese interests.
Russia strongly identifies as an Arctic state and would be unwilling to countenance a partnership with China where it's no longer the leader in that region. I think China is mindful of that and has tread cautiously with Russia in the Arctic.
As China has ramped up its investment around the world, the Arctic has become part of its global strategy.
China has integrated the Arctic in its Belt and Road initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road. And the idea is to build infrastructure to be able to use the region as a shipping route.
The 2018 Arctic White Paper by China states what national interest China sees for itself in the Arctic. Chinese are quite clear that they have an economic interest in the Arctic, and they have interest in the governance issue in the Arctic because the changes in the Arctic region has a global impact.
Chinese companies have sought investment opportunities in every Arctic country. But to local officials wary of China's ambitions, such investment is not always welcome.
China will use the same methods that it has done in the rest of the world to promote a Chinese agenda that is not just about making money, but it's also about establishing a strategic foothold
China's actions in Greenland have been very controversial. Chinese construction companies bid to renovate 3 airports, and that elicited concern in the United States. And Secretary of State Pompeo approached Denmark to warn them against this.
I think we should pay attention to anything that is a precursor to military presence in the Arctic. Investment in Greenland's airport for tourism, benign. Investment in Greenland's airport where you might ultimately control that as a base, not benign.
For many years, China controversially sought membership in the Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum for the 8 Arctic countries to discuss common issues. In 2013, China finally earned observer status within the council.
China has successfully got itself into the room of the Arctic Council, but it does not yet have a seat at the table. So that actually has created quite a lot of frustration in China about its Arctic policy.
Many years ago, we kind of had the Arctic to ourselves, but the latest development is that also non-Arctic states are very eager to take part in I think what they see as an Arctic adventure.
One of China's arguments is that because climate change in the Arctic is a threat multiplier, it affects China as well as Arctic states. But Arctic states claim that they are the stewards of the region and other states outside it should play by their rules.
American policymakers have taken an especially dim view of China's interest in the Arctic. In May 2019, at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo castigated Beijing for its behavior in the region.
There are only Arctic states and non-Arctic states. No third category exists, and claiming otherwise entitles China to exactly nothing.
Being there in the audience in that very speech, it was rather strange. There has been some sort of agreement that this is for functional cooperation. So let's keep it like that.
The criticisms and accusations made by individuals on the American side regarding China's involvement in Arctic affairs are completely inconsistent with the facts. Moreover, they are contrary to the general trend of peaceful cooperation in the Arctic.
Mike Pompeo placed the Arctic in the context of great power competition, which was also unusual for the Arctic Council because the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues.
In Mike Pompeo's defense, anytime you try to ignore reality for collegiality, you'll lose collegiality more permanently. It's very important that we recognize that our challenges with China and our challenges with Russia, we can't pretend they don't exist.
In 2019, an unusual proposal brought the Trump administration's Arctic strategy to the top of the nightly news.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting today that President Donald Trump and his senior advisors have floated the idea of purchasing Greenland. Officials from Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, have responded by publicly declaring that their island is not for sale.
Although the plan to buy Greenland was swiftly dismissed, American policymakers are paying more and more attention to the Earth's largest island.
The US has opened a consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, in May 2020.
It's a statement of America's commitment to the Arctic as non-Arctic states look to exploit the region for their own interests, as I warned of back at the Arctic Council.
The US has also approved of a minor aid package to Greenland. That's for purposes such as economic development, so that Greenland, for example, can start making money on tourism. That was one of the areas where China was interested in investing.
I think a lot of people don't know that we have an air base up in Greenland, the very tip top. I've been there a couple of times. Our facilities in Greenland, they're the pickets. They are the eyes and ears for the U.S., watching for threats coming from the east.
In Alaska, experts are sounding the alarm about the lack of American infrastructure in Arctic waters. The U.S., they say, is not prepared for the coming surge of shipping.
It reminds me of the stories of the early Arctic explorers, many of whom were, of course, rescued by Inuit. We will be, in all likelihood, the first responders because of the lack of infrastructure and availability of response services throughout the Arctic.
We're going to need icebreaker capacity to be available. We're going to need more Coast Guard investment. They need a full base on the western coast of Alaska that's fully operational and available.
In April of 2019, the Navy and Coast Guard awarded a contract to VT Halter Marine for the detailed design and construction of a polar security cutter. When we think about our maritime national security objectives and the need to support economic and commercial and our scientific interests, it's just critical that we begin to field these polar security cutters.
Fundamental to U.S. Arctic policy is the question of how to balance the Arctic's economic potential with global climate concerns.
For security purposes alone, the United States shouldn't be holding back on its oil and gas production capability. What we don't produce, the Saudis will, the Russians will, the Venezuelans will, and I believe it's very important for the United States to be a player in the global energy market.
We've already discovered enough fossil fuel reserves to push us beyond the safe level of warming that was agreed to in the Paris Climate Accords. Opening up new areas like the Arctic is completely inconsistent with limiting climate change to a safe level.
Now, policymakers must decide whether it is wise for the U.S. to spend the billions of dollars that would be required to turn the Arctic into a geopolitical battleground.
It's very expensive, both to build and to maintain. But if the United States is committed to this competition with China and with Russia, and if we believe that the Arctic is a worthwhile domain of that competition, this is the kind of investments that are necessary for us to be able to sustain that kind of intense engagement that's going to be required.
What we need is not competition. What we need is collaboration. It's a lot easier to work on the assumption that competition is inevitable, and therefore to funnel yet more money to the Navy and to the Air Force so that they can undertake this militarization of the Arctic. I think that would be a large mistake.
When the Arctic Council was founded in 1996, its members agreed to use the forum to discuss environmental and cultural issues rather than security.
The Arctic Council has as its primary objective to promote cooperation, coordination and interaction between the Arctic states and the Arctic inhabitants. It is explicitly stated that the Arctic Council is not dealing with military security. It's probably one of the main contributing factors to the Arctic Council being able to continue to operate, I would say, relatively unimpeded.
It has now a heavy emphasis on sort of climate change, environmental issues, practical economic cooperation between the participating states. I don't see that as changing. Security issues, I think, will be fairly difficult to bring into it.
Although the Arctic Council members had long cooperated on environmental issues, climate change became an unprecedented sticking point at the Council's 2019 summit in Finland.
In May 2019, the Arctic Council meeting was the first time that there was not a common declaration that was adopted at the end. And the main reason was that the United States did not want climate change to be mentioned.
We didn't sign today the Arctic Declaration. It is clear that the climate issues are different from the different viewpoints and from the different capitals.
Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Rovaniemi, Finland in May 2019 displayed that there are some new challenges. And the indigenous peoples organizations definitely expressed our concerns about that, as climate change is a major concern for us.
Some experts believe that if the Arctic Council is to remain collegial, it may be necessary to find a new forum to encourage dialogue between the US and its strategic rivals.
NATO allies and Russia, they have a body called the NATO-Russia Council. That's where the NATO allies discuss security and defense with Russia, and that should be the place where we continue to go and discuss these issues.
What we need to do is to be able to meet those nations with military forces up there and talk about confidence building measures. Talk about other ways that we can avoid surprising each other with military deployments. I would use a fora that's not set up yet, but I would use one that is not the Arctic Council.
Because the capitals of all 8 Arctic nations lie below the Arctic Circle, it will be essential for policymakers to listen to those who live in the region.
What I learned at being in the Senate is their inability to understand on the ground what's going on is pretty high. They don't live there. They don't live in a community that's 30 below. If the local communities in the state are not engaged, then it will be, in my view, a long-term disaster for the area.
If one recognizes that every matter in the Arctic region is interrelated, then the issues of security, militarization, stability, and all of the related matters concern us, concern the people who rely upon this environment.
Despite rising geopolitical tensions, the people who live in the Arctic are confident that the connections between neighbors will remain stronger than the forces of division.
Our fear is that if there is an increased militarization of the areas, that the opportunities and the possibilities for us as one people to interact could be affected. But we also put a lot of confidence in the Arctic Council and that body for being an arena for discussion and dialogue between neighbors.
Residents of the Arctic have long shared bonds that transcend national boundaries, forged by the common experience of life in a severe environment. Now, those bonds are being tested as the Earth's great powers turn their attention toward the top of the world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on.
Okay, just give me a minute to transition over to my slides. Okay, can everybody hear me again? You just nod, then I'll know you can hear me. Okay. I thought it might be helpful for us to see a map of exactly what we're talking about here in the Arctic. As you can see, Canada claims in here, Russian claims in here. The other one, Norway, has quite a few. And then over here on this side is the United States. So you can kind of see a more detailed map of what they were talking about in the video, and I thought that might just help us in our discussion. So we'll move on to the first question. Should countries that are part of the Arctic Council prioritize policies that would attempt to limit the melting of ice? And what do you think about that? Don't forget to unmute yourself when you talk.
Somebody help me out. Did they discuss that technique of how to limit the melting of ice?
Well, they talked, I think it was discussed more in the Great Decisions booklet than it was in the video, but in the Great Decisions booklet, they talked about the environmental challenges as the ice melts. Right now with the snow, the solar rays bounce off and reflect back up, but as the ice melts, the water below will absorb the solar rays and it'll contribute even greater to global warming. So they did talk about that a lot in the book, if you read that article. And I think they touched upon it a little bit in the video, but not a lot.
So that sounds like they're talking about the permafrost or it would change more light or heat in the area would change the, I don't know what the plant life and so forth, or if they have permafrost, that would eventually melt into just regular soil, which would make a difference. But I guess there's all kinds of ramifications of that, at least potentially. But I guess that's, if it's a potential problem, I assume somebody somewhere would have to meet to talk about it, figure out what to do.
Well, there was some discussion in the video to the point of some people that were saying that although lots of carbon was available, had become available because of the melting of the ice, and now they could drill up there and so on, and they could get a lot more gas and oil and so on. It would make it almost impossible to limit the global warming. So indirectly, is that what you were getting at, Terrence? Indirectly, in order to limit the melting of ice in the Arctic, we have to limit the warming over the entire globe, I think.
I would assume that would be the case. If it's a problem and it's because of the change in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but that could come from anywhere in the world, not just because they were doing something in the Arctic. But the effects, I was trying to figure out, well, what effects were they talking about specifically? And that's the one that came to mind, is that there's those huge areas way up north that are just the permanently frozen soil, except for the top layer, maybe in the summertime. And there may be big effects if that all would thaw out, which could be happening.
I think you two gentlemen raise a good point, because I mean, if the priorities of that region is one thing, but the 8 or 9 countries don't have the ability to just control, and say, hey, let's just focus on this one area and somehow it'll take care of itself, because really, air moves around and whatever moves around the world. So it is hard to just focus on that. I mean, if they want to emphasize it, yeah, that's fine. But you have to try to say that your priorities are somehow going to be enacted and take care of it. No, it has to be expanded outward.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just the countries that border the Arctic that will suffer the effects of climate change, it's the whole globe. So I think, are we in agreement that the Arctic Council should prioritize policies that would attempt to limit the melting of ice? Our little group here, we can change the future of the Arctic cap.
Well, I don't know. Did they talk about everything that's on their agendas? I mean, I assume there's any number of things that this council could be discussing, matters of interest. I assume these, whether these are problems or potential problems, I assume it would be something that it sounds like they're the organization that would deal with them.
Yeah, security and environment is kind of what they talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have anything they want to add to this discussion on this question? Should we move on to the next question? Do the economic benefits outweigh the environmental impact? I think we kind of touched on that with our previous question.
I can give a quick answer for myself, which is capital no. I don't think the economic benefits outweigh the environmental impact, especially in the light of the president, and he's not the only one, trying to establish a target of being carbon free by the middle of the century. Actually, earlier than that.
Sometimes that's it's a matter of they really don't put a price tag. If they don't put a price tag on the environmental impact, then it's hard to make a economic measure of a trade-off. I mean, conceivably, for example, sometimes it sounds as though if they're developing natural gas, there may be, as an example, as opposed to crude oil, might make a difference, for example, what the environmental impact is, even though there would presumably be one. But in this interim period, while there's this drive to get down the amount of carbon net in the atmosphere, conceivably, something like that would be something that could be measured as a trade-off. Because otherwise, for example, if that means more coal plants are operating because we don't get non-coal fuels in the interim, maybe that would be a bad trade-off, as opposed to, well, like what we're seeing locally, is that the coal plants locally are closing here in Wisconsin, which presumably will be a benefit to these environmental issues. So sometimes it's, there's some of that to take into account. But, I don't know, we have that specific information about this, about the Arctic in particular.
I do think it's a tricky question, right? And that's, I guess, the point of these. The thing about like an environmental impact, when you hear these kind of comments about like, oh, it's going to, impact the environment, well, that's always assumed that it's like a long-lasting, permanent, and somehow the environment doesn't somehow come back. Yes, if you're damaging it permanently, that's a whole different argument. But I think it's always presented as if this ice is melting and it'll never come back. And is that really the case in these, these kind of models that they do? So I think that's where some of that science becomes a little bit speculative.
But I think the other piece of an environmental impact and economic benefit is, who is it really benefiting? Is it going to benefit the people that live up there, whose potential environment is going to be undergo a great upheaval because we mine, we drill for oil, we look for other, other products? And is it only the company that's doing the drilling or the country that's doing the drilling, and it will not return to the people that actually live up there full time?
That's a very good point. Anybody else have anything they want to add? Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Why has the United States been a reluctant Arctic nation in the past? I think some of it is, I'll just start this out. I think some of it is because we don't really consider ourselves an Arctic nation because Alaska is so far away, it's just so far removed from us in the lower 48 that maybe we don't really consider ourselves an Arctic nation.
Actually, if you land in Anchorage, you're still a long way from the actual Arctic. So yeah, it's a long way away.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, it's probably just that it's a harder region to get things accomplished in. I mean, if you're dealing with thick ice or cold temperatures, or just even the travel distance, well, isn't it easier to get your materials or whatever you're needing to do elsewhere? If you want to get oil, well, the Middle East exists, minerals wherever. It just seems like that's a much more challenging area, that the reward versus the effort may have not been perceived as being worth it.
I also took away from the video that in the most recent administration, a lot more focus, again, based on actions by Russia and China, was more of a security focus, and that wasn't what the Arctic Council's about. There has to be other forums to pursue that, and there wasn't as much interest in the global warming and the environment. So I'm not sure that we have the right forum or ways to get involved.
Well, the very early part of the video pointed out that basically 100 years ago, when the early Arctic explorers, what was his name, Amundsen something, had struggled and had made had eventually gotten through with the Northwest Passage, but was it the Wall Street Journal that pronounced that it was unlikely to result in any benefit to shipping because it was so difficult, and we didn't. And I think we always had other things to do, and the Arctic was so dead blame tough. But now that the other people want it, or the influence at least of China and Russia, and we're concerned about losing influence, and so we're playing catch up some. And if we do change, do you think it'll come at the expense of our involvement in the Middle East?
Maybe that's is that one of the presentations we've got coming up? Because there's always that question of a lot of our involvement in the U.S. involvement in the Middle East came from the fact that the oil resources were discovered, and I think that was only in the 1930s. So, that it became a security interest. And if that changes, if eventually, their Middle Eastern countries are a relatively small factor in oil production, oil and gas production, and if the demand for oil and gas decreases, well, that's a whole separate question about, well, how's that going to affect these kinds of strategic questions.
Anybody else have anything they want to add?
I will say I do have some military background, but nothing in the Arctic. But I was not aware that Norway and Russia actually have a small but significant common border north of Finland, and that area, Russia pretty jealous of that because that is their access to year-round water. So a lot of opportunities for conflict in there.
Mm-hmm. How much should the U.S. government spend towards increasing influence and capacity in the Arctic, in your opinion? Nothing? Billions? Trillions? What's money?
I can see that Terrence is working the figures right now. He's got a pencil. He's
got his calculator out.
Yeah, clickety click. Ann's probably doing that as well.
Seems like right now, with everything we have to deal with at home, can't see a lot left over, but we always seem to find a way.
I guess this is about, would it change priorities within, the security spending or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
But exactly, maybe that wouldn't mean more money. Maybe something else would make a difference there. Maybe we wouldn't be spending as much in the Middle East. Who knows?
Yeah,
it would all be a wash.
Yeah, I think it was you, Eddie, who said maybe we won't have to deal with the Middle East, right? We can move everything to the Arctic.
Anything the military does is going to be, in my experience, is breathtakingly expensive. And if anything, the Arctic, just dealing with what did they say in the last couple of sentences? Something about the extreme or unforgiving environment, and but we can learn it.
Well, weren't there times this past winter when we were colder than they were up here?
Yes, but probably
so
on Anchorage. If you go up into the northern part of Alaska, it's dramatically colder.
Yeah. I don't know. I was just reading today the equipment that we have for ice breaking. I mean, we would have to put a significant investment into our machines, just to clear the ice. And
it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Did I read, or was it that the Coast Guard general that spoke 2 or 3 times, talked about we have I guess it's a mixture, because in the book they talked about that we have some icebreakers, but they're getting very old and they're one of them. We're having to cannibalize from take parts off of one to keep the other one going. And I think the female Coast Guard general officer spoke about the project of building another bigger, better, faster icebreaker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, for sure. There would have to be some equipment created. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to this? What could be some of the negative effects should the Arctic become another point of contention between the US and China? I mean, there's some obvious ones.
I suppose it could be another source of strain in the economic and trade area. Not that they're directly connected, but that it would have that effect if, at least if, for example, if we're more vulnerable than China in the very large trade that we have between us, then I suppose that gives them leverage. And if if they feel aggrieved about something in our policy in the Arctic versus theirs, we could see more of that.
Go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, the only other thing I thought is perhaps, we end up spending that much more money, right, to try to almost like you don't want to say arms race, but whatever you do up there, you divert that much more of your resources, your finances towards trying to, compete either way. So is it a good spend? I think that's a good use of our resources. Knowing that we have enough other things going on here. I mean, doesn't mean it's not important, but how much do you, do, and does it become, something that really just like Russia, when Russia was trying to keep spending with us, maybe during that Cold War, did that, cause some of the issues for them.
A complicated area is I suspect we would both compete for influence with the Arctic nations. On page 50, they talk about touch on that a little bit. Canada, but that's not so much, but the Denmark/Greenland and Norway and those areas we would, we're interested, I think, in seeing NATO have more influence up there, and so all of that. I'm not sure it'll be a complicated, because there are going to be lots of moving parts with these other countries, and we'll be building. Both sides will be competing to build. China offered some money and to build some things, and you heard Pompeo trying to draw the line and saying, well, if you're building something just for tourism, that's okay, but if you're building something, an air base that could be then transitioned to a military resource, that's not okay. And so I think that will be a point of competition.
It does seem like the United States has maybe a little edge. It's with the countries, the Arctic countries, just from reading the book. Would you say that, Eddie? We have better relationships with all the Arctic countries, with the exception of Russia.
And yes, exactly. Russia, however, is a really big Arctic country.
Mhm.
They have lots and lots of real estate.
Yeah.
But yes, I think you're right. The other countries would probably prefer to be allied with us.
Mm-hmm.
But China's growing rapidly, and they're pretty good at it, as we saw in one of the other chapters about the Belt and Road.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it is, I think, because with their trade, they ended up with so much currency from some of these countries that it was relatively easy for them to go back in and invest, but they were sort of tricky about it because they made everything alone, like the railroads in Africa, and then they maybe have more influence if it's like the student debt sort of a thing. The African country gets more debt that they can handle, and China has a lot of experience with that. We haven't done as much of that. Is my understanding. But one thing about these subjects have certainly drawn me into reading about things that I didn't know much about before.
Yeah. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have spent an afternoon reading about the Arctic if I were to. I'm kind of tired of snow. I didn't really want to look at it anymore. Can the U.S. look to use the region as a potential source of cooperation with China? Anybody have an opinion on this one?
It went by pretty, I'm doing too much. So if you please, other people cut me off. It went by pretty quickly, but there was, in the video, there was someone that came on, they quoted two spokespersons for organizations. And one of them was talking about we should collaborate. We should be working to try to collaborate, for example, with China, instead of immediately seeing everything as a competition. Even though my background is in the military, I think we should, hopefully our leadership should not assume that everything is a military competition, that we must, and because there are areas where we should be able to collaborate. Or is that being Pollyanna?
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to look at things from both perspectives. Like, what could be the benefit of, what's the risk benefit? Do you know what I mean? If we cooperate, I think that line of thinking should be considered. May not be the direction, but should be considered.
Anybody else want to chime in? Ah, that was it. Does anybody else have, other than these questions, does anybody else have anything they're kind of questioning or wondering about they want to speak about?
No question, but a great video.
That was good. Better than average video. How many people here have been north of the Arctic Circle on the surface?
No. Been up here.
No.
Okay, if we don't have anything else to add, next week's topic is the two Koreas. And this discussion will be led by our librarian, Laura. And it'll be the same format that we had tonight. So I hope everybody can attend and tell your friends and neighbors about it. More people, more discussion. It's a good thing. March 17th, we'll be talking about the World Health Organization's response to COVID-19. And then to end it on March 24th, we'll talk about the end of globalization. That seemed like a fitting end to the series this year. So I thank everybody for coming. I hope you can, it's good discussion tonight, and I hope that you can make it next week. Thank you.
Thanks, King.
Thank you for doing this, sponsoring it.
Good, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too.